Brant, we are live.
Hello, hello.
So, you know, we talked a little bit about it, you and I, how I thought might be the worst possible live television of all time, just watching me fumble around, trying to figure this out. You said, hey, it actually might be great television.
That's right.
But that is what's happened here. The reason we're going live at 2:18 rather than 2:10 is because you got to watch me fumble around. And here we finally are. So Brant Snow, VP of Technology at Extensive, thank you so much for joining me today.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
It's my absolute pleasure. And I mentioned that I was going to have to do some navigation. In addition to Zoom not wanting to let me do this at all, it seems to have helped me at least get to the place I needed to go without a bunch of muting and going back and forth, et cetera, et cetera. So we can jump right into this thing. And I appreciate you being here. If you'll allow me just really quickly to let anybody who's joining, and that's one thing I actually don't see if we've had anyone join us yet, but I would just like to mention to anybody who's watching this, whether in real time or after the fact, that this is the beginning of a series. You're the second guest. Thanks again for joining. And the goal here is to take technology leaders like yourself, ask you questions about your journey, how you got to where you are. And again, the goal ultimately is to help anybody in like the early to mid point in their career who has goals to eventually get to where you've gotten, understand how to get there. So I'm going to ask a series of questions, and I'm going to turn the time over mostly to you moving forward. I think first and foremost, can you give just a very brief kind of overview of your current role, your current day-to-day, et cetera?
Sure. So my current role is VP of Technology at Extensive. It is a SaaS-based offering in the logistics space, headquarters out of California. We have offices and employees, like most companies, in quite a different disparate areas in the world. We started off in the mainly third-party logistics space, but we've really expanded either through our products or through acquisitions to anything fulfillment related. So this goes to facilities, whether it's brands, whether it's moving orders around, integrations, platforms. So it's really exciting time.
Yeah.
I'm really trying to create that future of e-commerce fulfillment for everyone in the space.
Yeah, I was going to say it's the last few years have been fortuitous on some levels, I'm sure, but also quite hectic on others, right?
Yeah, that's a very good assessment. But yes, COVID has definitely put a light on the need to ship and move products quickly and easily, track it and understand where things are at.
Indeed.
For sure.
Very cool. Awesome. Well, thank you for that. So I think in terms of again, just jumping into some of these questions, I'd love to know, and we've talked a couple of times in the past leading up to this, but I don't know if I've ever asked kind of what brought you to a career in technology and why you ultimately chose it.
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. There's probably a couple different things. My mom actually was in technology. So she had graduated from university, the first woman to graduate in computer science with a master's in computer science from a local university here in Utah.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, she used to work for the Army. She worked on the radar system for, if you're familiar with the movie The Hunt for the Red October, the submarine, the U.S. submarine there. So she worked quite a bit in the technology space, worked for Intel and other companies. So I'd love to say that I was just so inspired by her, but probably I think the real reason is I'm a very old millennial or very young Gen Z. I'm kind of on that borderline. And when I was growing up and really young, it took a lot more to get your computer running for your games, or to get to somewhere, to get to BBS, something to that effect. So I had to spend a lot more time with technology just to, do something that I wanted to do. So we'd have to alter files on Windows to stop it from loading because it was taking up too much conventional memory and I couldn't run the games that I wanted to. So we kind of had to tool around and play with things enough to kind of get what we wanted. And that, got me excited about the field and got me some good experience. So officially, I'm going to say my mom was a great representative, and that's the true story. But the unofficial is I had to tinker with things enough that I enjoyed it.
I love it. And I think it's indicative of a lot of people's journeys where there are multiple influences, right? That kind of get you there to that path. But that's cool. And I mean, realistically, like what an amazing thing to hear that your mom was the first, right? With the MS from that school. Very cool. So this is a tough question to answer briefly, but can you share, in your opinion, some of the highlights of your career to this point?
Oh gosh, highlights. There's a lot, and some of them are kind of accomplishments, and some of them are just things that I got to play with. I would say, when mobile apps were starting to come out, when I did my first mobile app, that was just such an amazing feeling. And it was so different than, what I'd been doing strictly, on the internet. And so that was just kind of a personal highlight that I loved kind of working on. So I'm kind of thinking of fun projects, right? There was a project where I did some GPS tracking for a kind of a marketing event as people toured across the country. And people could go and see where they were on the freeway and the highway and interact with these people. We quickly realized at night they were frequenting places that were probably not appropriate, and people would often call us and say, "Why are they at this?" I won't go into where they were at, but we inevitably had to kind of shut down the GPS on those activities as they were going through. But I think, for me, I've always been more of a product person. I've really enjoyed giving something to someone and seeing them say, "Wow, this is amazing. Wow, this is great," right? I think that's always been kind of the drive for me. So I think that's really where the highlights are, having worked on products and having someone come back and say, "Wow, this is amazing," or "I really love this." I think that's where most of the highlights for me personally come from.
That makes sense. I certainly feel like I could relate to that, just
Right.
seeing the impact of your work. And very cool. I should mention, because we have had a few people join, that I've got Brant Snow, the VP of Technology at Extensive, here with me today. We're going through kind of a trip down memory lane thus far, but I've got a handful of questions for Brant. Thanks so much for joining. And yeah, we basically wrapped up kind of the early stuff. I think, insofar as I understand it, Brant, and this is one of those areas where I can see in real time where I might have asked a question before the camera went live, so to speak.
Sure.
But it looks like you more or less have kind of been in a similar space, similar industry throughout your career. Is that fair to say?
Industry as far as, the product offerings that were represented, or maybe you can kind
Correct.
of
Yes, sir.
elaborate on that.
Yeah, that's exactly what I mean.
Yeah, so I spent some time, I would say, in kind of the SaaS-based world where the product is technology. And then I spent some time as well in a world where technology was a supportive role, but it wasn't the main product of that company, right? And I would say it has varied, the technology footprint has varied drastically between those two scenarios, right? So whereas, a SaaS company, or a company that has a product that's technology, these are the Ubers, These are extensive, the Googles, compared to, say, a company like Nike or Adidas, where they're selling something else, but IT really powers a lot of that back end. Just the scale on the straight technology companies is so different, and the level of support. But what I continue to see is that trend's rising even more in the non-product related technology companies, just as tech starts to have just a larger footprint on marketing, on communication, on every different aspect of how that business is running. It's so hard for almost every company has to be a tech company nowadays, if that makes sense. Whereas historically it was, well, we're we're a shoe business and we just kind of have a couple IT systems to support it. I think that that's really not the case anymore, and you see just tech and code eating away at so many different things across every industry.
Indeed. Yeah. And I appreciate that. Obviously you did your research in preparing for the questions, because you preempted the question of how, technologies kind of varied in the different industries that you've supported. I appreciate the answer there. So we'll pivot a little bit here. And again, the purpose of this conversation ultimately is to try to add value to the greater technology community, particularly those that are maybe a little earlier in their careers. I'm curious, what advice would you offer to someone in an earlier mid point in their career, an individual contributor, as it relates to networking? And specifically what I mean by that is building a social network.
Yeah, so I think this is a great question. I mean, I think a lot of people get into technology because they wanted to not have to work with people to a certain degree, or at least historically, that's what a lot of people did. I think it's less now. But networking is really important. And I think communication and collaboration are more in demand in technology now than ever really before, right? And especially when you're working on innovative products and new approaches on how you're doing things, you have teams that really have to collaborate and come up with new solutions that we've never really had before, right? If you're solving the same problem, you may not need that same level of collaboration. But so as far as networking, I would say, get to know the people that you work with well, associate with them well. I would go to meetup events. I do love meetup events, or hackathons in regards to networking. Stay close to your coworkers that move on from your company. Stay in contact with them, especially if they were good mentors or provided some kind of good insight into them. You'd be surprised how many times you'll cross paths again in the industry later on. And I would say that just the other thing is just be aware that it is a large industry, but it is a small industry as well. It is very common. What you see and what you get to know will spread around, and that's how people will kind of identify you. So make sure you're not burning bridges randomly for no reason, because that will get around. But definitely try to network, be aggressive. There's times where I sent out emails to random people or hiring managers, say, hey, I'm working on this project and I'm just doing it for fun. If you have questions or thoughts, you could go there. I think one of the great things in the technology space is that the cost of experimentation is so low. And so I would take that same approach to networking. Don't just really be fearless and to go out there. And that's what I would say.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's sage advice, and it is simple, not easy, especially the second part of what you just described. But I think the first part is what I'd really want to highlight, because to your point, when you're working with people, you're building those relationships. That's going to happen no matter what. So then it doesn't take a lot, right, to stay in touch. Simply, a congratulations on LinkedIn, or a occasional text, how are things. Those that matters. And I think that's incredibly important advice. So I appreciate that very much.
Yeah, even to have like a kind of a close circle, I maintain a group of individuals that I routinely will reach out to that I've known over the years when I'm coming up against different challenges. How do you address this in your organization, or what have you historically done? And whether that's technology related or management related, having a close knit kind of group of individuals that you can consult with and kind of share not industry or proprietary secrets, obviously, but engineering and technology and best practices, I think is a great example. If you take a look at Agile, when the Agile Manifesto, when they all came together, a group of disparate individuals, but kind of came and shared their joint experiences and said, how do we push something forward? Try to maintain that inner circle, I would say, is super valuable.
Yeah, I appreciate that very much. I think that's, for those that maybe don't necessarily feel that they can be fearless, that right there, what you just described really is the key in my mind to great networking. You mentioned already the word mentor, and I'm curious how mentors have played a part in your career thus far.
Yeah, so I would say, I think everyone, when they're starting out in their career, whether they know it or not, they really do want a mentor. I think it's really hard to find a good mentor. And by that, what I mean is, I think it's really hard to find someone who is genuinely interested in your success and growth. And what that means is, it doesn't always mean, being socially kind and perfect to you. Some of those times they will be a little bit more honest or blunt with you to say, hey, these are areas that you really need to shore up, or these are areas that you really need to work on. Which, we see in the tech industry all the time. If you talk about going to postmortems, we've all had experience where we've done something. We can't really hide it. It's been out there in the ethosphere. Customers have been affected. There may be some SOAs that were affected. And, you just have to realize you've made a mistake. So it's really hard to hide mistakes in the tech industry, I guess I would say. And with that in guard, you start to develop where you're open with your team, and your team realizes that everyone's kind of doing their best. You're going to make mistakes, but kind of keeping that with a mentor who's open and honest about, how you're doing, where are the areas you need to focus on, what you can do there. I wish I had better advice about how to find a great mentor. But I don't know that I do. I think I've been lucky to have one or two really, really good ones. And I think there are a period of times where I really wanted someone and I didn't have that. And so I guess I feel kind of lucky in a certain sense. But if you have someone that's willing to kind of take you under their wing and kind of be honest with you, then I think you should definitely exploit that relationship as much as you can. And honestly, I think for most people in tech, a lot of people in tech like to give back. If you take a look at the industries, attorneys, lawyers are the most proprietary, where everything is confidential, and anything you produce, you need to be paid for and you own all the rights to. And if you take a look at tech is the complete opposite, where everyone's so open and there's so much open source and there's just such this desire to help new people, right? You can never imagine that coming from an attorney's background. It just so happens a lot of the males in my family are attorneys, but anything that anyone says, it's like, no, that's copyrighted. That's mine. No one shall ever do anything else. Tech is very free with wanting to, get new people into the industry, train them up. So, you're going to have possibilities and chances to find someone that's excited to help you kind of mature and take advantage of that.
Yeah, I love that. I think to your point, a couple of things. One, I certainly have ideas about how to find mentors for anybody watching, or, now in real time or after the fact. I'm happy to field some of those questions. I will say quickly that it's exactly what you just said, Brent, asking questions, But I think the real key to beginning that mentor relationship is following up with the person that you've asked the question and saying, here's what I did and here was the result, and perhaps asking another question. You've got to gauge whether or not they're open to that. But I think you nailed it. I mean, this industry really is, and from what I've seen, very open to sharing knowledge, and that generally does lead to the best kind of entry point to finding a mentor. Like I said, I'm happy to address that with anyone who is finding it difficult. But thanks again for your thoughts on that. Curious, now looking back, and I know you're not that far removed from these days, Brent, but if you could,
you said I'm old, Scotty. How dare you?
if you could go back and give one piece of advice to the self that is early 20s, mid 20s, what would that be?
Yes, I think there's a few things. There's a lot of things, but I think if we're talking specifically technology related, I would say going back, and I've done this since, I wish I'd done it earlier, would be to do a kind of full SaaS offering nuts to bolts. In other words, doing the client side code, doing the server side code, doing the hosting, doing the security, giving yourself like a broad sense of how that really all comes together. I think when I did that was an amazing experience and really gave me a lot of empathy for all the different pieces of the software assembly line, right? And we have a tendency to specialize in an area. You kind of have these T-shaped developers, which is great. Specialization is amazing and it has a lot of productive gains. But definitely you produce things as a team. And if you don't understand how some of those basics work on some of those different areas, it's going to be a little bit harder for you to empathize or work in that team environment. So I would say, doing a project of your own that you kind of challenges your limits and pushes you outside of some of the areas you wanted to specialize in, just so you have some experience and exposure in there. And then I would say the other thing is one thing that I did a little bit later too. I took a portion of my salary. So I started with $100 a month is what I did. And I said, okay, this $100 a month is purely for learning and playing. So it was, I could buy courses online, I could do subscriptions, I could do certifications. And at the time, when I did that $100 a month, that was a pretty big commitment for me. I was barely saving hardly anything at all. And I was, younger. And so that was a really hard commitment. But that really, paid itself back so many times over. And it really kind of put me in charge of my own destiny rather than always trying to say, I need someone else to teach me or to pay for my learning or any of those different things. So I think that was great. And I use it to play along. When Twilio came out, I would grab the Twilio, pay a couple dollars, and I would make prank calls to my friends, right? All those things that were really fun. I'd wake them up in the middle of the night and they're like, who was this? But it was kind of, it really allowed that fearlessness that I talked about, to let yourself go out there and try all these things and not be afraid to fail or to do them. But it kind of gave me a little avenue, and I've kind of upped that budget a little bit as I've gone throughout there. But reinvest in yourself, right? Make sure you have something that's towards that continuing education, whether it's money, whether it's that mentoring, whether it's those meetups, right? Have something that you're reinvesting in yourself. And just know that that's going to be part of your life journey, I guess I would say.
Well, I think, it's one thing to say, investing in yourself will pay dividends, right? We've all heard that. But to hear the practical advice as to how you did that, I think that's super valuable. And and again, it's, you're another example here of someone who did that, and it does pay dividends, right? It's
Right.
it's something we all have heard before, but to see kind of how that's paid off for you, that's awesome. So I love that. Great advice again for someone who may just be starting out, or for somebody who's evaluating what they would maybe have done differently. It's not
Sure.
too late, right? So very cool. Again, real quick, just for those that have joined since we started, I think needless to say, my name's Scotty John. You're on my LinkedIn page, so you know that. But I've got Brant Snow, the VP of Technology at Extensive here, answering questions. Been so gracious to share his knowledge and his time with us. And we're gonna again shift a little bit here to the last kind of part of the conversation, where I want to start by asking what, when you're looking for your direct reports, the people that are going to be on your team, and I'm curious, not just for those that are reporting directly to you, which I imagine are mostly leaders these days,
Right.
but also the individual contributors that you guys are looking to hire. What do you look for? What makes a good IC, and what makes a good leader for you personally on your team, Brant?
Yeah, so I think it's largely the same thing. And I think it really kind of comes down to, well, there's a lot of things that go into it. I have my book, Tech is Easy, People is Hard, which is a total oversimplification. But the reality is a lot of the things that we struggle in the technology industry are more communication and collaboration related, right? We have all these different people. How do we work together and move forward a product as quickly and easily as possible? And so I think from like a direct hire, I call it the lay down at night effect. When you lay down at night, when you're sitting on your pillow, what are the problems that you have come up in your mind that you worry about for your job or your company or your industry? And to be able to hire someone that you can really trust to take that kind of cognitive load off your mind, not that you're not going to be checking in with them, not that you're not going to be overseeing them, but someone that you say, okay, I've got this person there. I know they will handle things as they arise. They will escalate things appropriately when they occur. And I've got someone there who I can trust. And I guess I would say, to kind of dovetail on that, when I say trust, I really mean an engaged individual, right? I'm a big believer of most things don't really get done until there's a champion assigned. And so this is a person that's responsible to make sure something actually occurs. They don't actually have to do the work necessarily, but they're the ones, when you're leaving in a meeting, they say, okay, before we all leave, who was going to do what, and how do we make sure we keep moving forward, as opposed to someone that's really hoping just to kind of get lost in the weeds, and until someone calls them out, they're not really going to engage. So I'd say an engaged employee, and someone that can kind of help, that you can trust and remove some of those burdens off of your mind.
Awesome. Very cool. I'm sure a much more difficult question is how you assess that, right? And I won't ask you to go into the detail there, because I'm sure that that does extend this conversation greatly. But I think for our purposes today, and trying to keep your answer somewhat brief, that's great, and I love that. And I was remiss in not mentioning that you do have a book. You are a published author, so to speak. So we'll talk a little bit more at the end of the conversation today, where people can find that. And yeah, I think it'd be worth, again, for anybody who's watching this right now, it'd be worth checking out. Okay, just a couple more questions, and then I'll let you jump to the rest of your day, Brant.
Sure.
What would you say, again, at your level especially, what makes a VP of technology successful in the eyes of the C-suite?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and largely I'm going to kind of give you my experience with it. And some of that, I kind of go into the book, but so I actually went and got an MBA, which is a very unusual, or historically was unusual in the tech field. Um, but what had happened, and my employer actually paid for it, and the reason was they had a lot of projects where they just weren't working great with the technology side of the house. Um, you know, different personalities, different mindsets, and the teams just really weren't on the same page as far as how they were going to drive things forward. And I definitely saw in my experience that there were a lot more projects, almost entirely projects ended up failing a lot more often, less because of technological reasons and more because of kind of communication and collaboration issues, or just kind of not being on the same page, right? So a misalignment of expectations. So I think for a technology executive to be successful really in the eyes of the C-suite is to first understand what the objectives of the C-suite is, right? I think it's easy to get into this concept of, well, I'm in my isolated bubble and I have this code that's perfect and I love it and it's so great. But if it's not really doing anything for the customers, it doesn't really provide any value, right? And that's where, you start getting into a lot of the concepts of the Agile manifesto, where it was, we're putting stuff out there, we're experimenting, and that can be a lot harder, right? Like it's a lot harder to say, we have a moving target. We're sometimes building the plane as we're going along, and it would be a lot easier to say, hey, here's a year, this is what we want to build, but that's never going to be the case, and there's just so much risk in that. And so you really need to put stuff out there, validate it with the customers, make sure it's going in the right direction. And that's what the C-suite looks for a lot, right? Someone that's really bought into that vision of how do we put forward our ideas and what our product managers are saying, test, validate, move that forward quickly in a secure and a safe manner, but really be bought into that vision of what we're trying to accomplish here. And so I think honestly, I think that's the biggest thing, and as far as the C-suite agreeing and what they see success in a position in the technology side.
That's, I again, in my mind, like that, it kind of, maybe it's confirmation bias, right? But to me, that you kind of nailed exactly what the C-suite is looking for. But what's interesting is how often that doesn't necessarily happen. I suspect that the communication piece, where the rubber hits the road, is for you then as the VP to make sure that you're communicating effectively all the way to the IC level in your org as well, correct?
Yes. And I'll give a great example of this that you can kind of, rather than my anecdotal interpretation, although this is still very anecdotal, you see this a lot in the industry. And I talk to a lot of friends where, they'll have an IT department, and, the C-suite or someone's really looking for some reports or some information about different things that they're trying to do. And there's a number of different companies that have kind of spawned up in this arena. And rather, they'll work with the IT department or the technology department for so long, and then they will do somewhat of the unthinkable, which is they will direct, hey, we want you to send all of your data over to this other third party. This third party is then going to crunch everything, and they're finally going to give us what we really want, right? And so what you see is there's such a disconnect between, and the IT department's like, well, I gave them exactly what they asked for, but it's not about what people ask for, it's what they respond to, if that makes sense, right? And so there's a delicate balance between, I'm doing what was said, but am I really making sure this is working for them? Do they really engage with them? Do they really like it? But taking a look at a company that ships all of its information off to a different company to pull and run analytics to give back to the C-suite shows just a complete lack of expectations and being on the same page in a company in IT, right? And I mean, your data is your most valuable possession, and now you're shipping it to someone else because your CEO or someone else doesn't feel they can get the information that they want from you, right? So that just really shows that disconnect that sometimes exists.
No doubt, no doubt. And not only that, but paying a pretty penny per hour
Yeah.
for
Yes.
those insights, right?
Yes, and you're going to be sitting there being like, we're paying 10x what
Right.
what we would be doing. Why aren't they just using it? But it just really, it does illustrate the problem that you do see.
It does indeed. Okay. Well, I don't think there's anything else to add to that for now, at least. And I appreciate that insight very much. All right. Last question. Again, I think every question I've asked you today, we could spend, a whole half an hour really diving into. This is another one that's unfair to try to sum up in a briefly, but we'll do our best. What trends this is all over the news, but in your opinion, Brent, what trends do you really see coming down the pipeline, so to speak, in technology in the coming years?
Yeah, so I think when you said all over the news, I think you've got to be referring to generative AI, right? And I think there's just this, we're at a point, kind of what the internet did, where it's just going to revolutionize what we do in so many different ways. And I think we honestly have no idea quite what that's going to look like. And we've had this concept of AI for so long. But it's kind of like until you reach a certain point of adoption where it's just not efficacious. And I'll use the iPods as a great example. iPods came out, MP3 players, there were a million other MP3 players before iPods. But they came out, you had the service, and finally it was good enough that there was just mass adoption, right? Whereas before it was nothing really kind of took off. And, I've done a lot of nano degrees on AI and machine learning, and it was largely, we have more computations now, we can do larger brute force. Now we're starting to, have some kind of small neural networks, but we haven't really seen anything to the point now with things like ChatGPT or some of these other elements where a machine can really understand what a human is trying to accomplish. And I think that's such a huge change. And, we've all had those experiences where, you're talking to a Siri or someone else and you say, hey, it looks cold outside. And they say, calling Mr. Cold Outside or something to that effect. And you're just like, machines are idiots, right? And now there's kind of a platform where that human context can really be digested. And so that just leads to whether it's images, whether it's content, whether that's coding assistance, better at identifying cancer in images, being able to represent individuals at court. It's intriguing and also kind of somewhat scary, right? But there's always been the Skynet equivalent for Terminator, and I've always said, well, if there's going to be a Skynet, I would rather not be in the target of it, but one of the people pulling the strings behind the scenes, right? So I do think that there's a lot of value in being in the technology space, really to help drive some of that generative AI as we see that, and continuing to, as I said, all companies are having to become a tech company, and that's just going to, with this, generative AI and other things, that's just going to keep expanding, where it just permeates so much about what we do every day.
Indeed. Yeah. No, that's great insight, and for what it's worth, I tend to agree, and it will be nothing if not interesting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Yeah, it is. I think we don't really understand the full. It's going to take a while to process that, but we really are on a threshold where we've kind of, eclipse that point where now we have something that kind of fulfills that promise of, someone that can really understand what we're talking about. And it just opens up so many possibilities.
Indeed. Very cool. All right. Well, before I let you go, I will obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, I will tag you in this this LinkedIn post that that this video, this live will become. So people will be able to find you on LinkedIn and follow you there. I know you have a couple of other areas where you can be found. I'd love to give you the opportunity to point people in that direction. And again, I'd love to have you just give a brief summary of the book that you've written, which again, I will actually put a link to go and purchase that book. Unless you have it up for free, I can't recall, but I'll make sure that there's a link to find it in the comments of this post. So please, Brent, tell the folks that are either watching us in real time or after the fact where they can find you.
Yep. Yes, I do have a book, Tech is Easy, People Are Hard, and it really goes through a lot of the architectural challenges that we have are more around people issues than necessary technological issues. It is on Amazon. You have to have a charge for it there. If you want a free copy, just email me. I'm not sure if you can get contact information. I didn't make it to sell. I made it so when someone asked me a question, I could say, okay, here you go. Here's a short little thing. Let me give it to you. I don't have to go into this spiel again. So I'm happy to kind of give that. But, I'm on LinkedIn. I do a lot of fun videos, as you know.
Indeed.
And so I'm not sure we could maybe share some of those, but LinkedIn's probably the best way to get a hold of me and kind of stay in contact.
Indeed. Yeah. And again, to follow you on LinkedIn, where there will be opportunities to see your book, but I will link to that. And also you mentioned it, you've got, I don't know if you call it a channel, but you do have some great videos on YouTube that I have watched and I recommend. So Brant Snow, the VP of Technology at Extensive. Thank you so much, Brant. I really appreciate you being here. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for taking all the time, especially given it took me as long as it did to get us actually live here. And for those of you watching, I know there've been some really great comments. So I know there's a few great people watching. Thanks for being here. And I hate to say it, these are semi-regular and there's no kind of rhyme or reason to when they're happening, but you can find them all on my page as posts. So Brant, thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Great
My
time.
pleasure. All right.
Yep.
Cheers.
Cheers.